8 o'clock on a Monday evening, December the 7th. Pat Gonzalez along with Stuart Nodell, my co-host with tonight's edition of Track Announcer's Notebook, as we are going to have two very interesting guests. And when I was doing my homework and research, it's amazing how their life in motorcycling has followed very similar paths from being a motorcyclist at an early age, running a dealership, and then for many, many years being involved with various original manufacturers. We'll get into our conversation with Chris Ellis and Nathan Naslund in just a few minutes. But first up, we're going to check out Nodell's notes for tonight. Stuart, what do you have?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. I'll just share my screen because really to start off this evening, we have some sad news to share with racer Lloyd Bailey down at Homestead, Florida this past weekend, who passed during one of the ASRA races.
Yeah. On the weekend, of course, was the finale for the American Sport Bike Racing Association, along with the ASRA Team Challenge and CCS races down there. And tragically, in Saturday's ASRA Team Challenge, Lloyd Bailey, a very good, very experienced 43-year-old rider from DeLand, Florida. Richard Chambers and I, as you know, have announced the races at Daytona for many, many years now. And Lloyd was always there, both in March and back again in the fall, racing in the big bore classes, consistently top 5, top 10. I think the incident is still under investigation as to exactly what happened, but it looked, the conjecture is that he had some kind of break.
These are just a few of the photos of Lloyd Bailey that I was able to capture from Road Racing World. So I thought I'd just share these with you.
Just as we're talking about Lloyd Bailey, very talented rider, as we're saying, Richard and I called so many of his great rides at Daytona. Very much liked in the paddock, as we said, consistent top 5, top 10 racer, and gone obviously far too soon. So our condolences go out to his family and the entire ASRA and CCS community. Lloyd will be missed, and I'm sure in the days and weeks to come, we'll be hearing more as they celebrate a fine racer, Lloyd Bailey of DeLand, Florida. Stuart?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. On a positive note, I had a call earlier this evening from Jeff Williams, probably around 5 o'clock, and he's in really great spirits. He's doing really well. He said he's been in the gym about 4 days a week over the course of the last 7 weeks. So it looks like his ACL, the tendons are still severed. And what he's saying is the doctor is suggesting just to keep going and he can rehab without surgery. Apparently the surgery that he would have to undergo would require a minimum 1 year of recuperation time. So he's just going to continue to let it heal naturally. And he looks and sounds like he's in great spirits. So it seems like he's had a full recovery for the most part. And it's great news to hear from him and hear how great he's doing. And I think he's really excited about racing cars next year.
Yeah,
he's apparently he's already bought a truck car, like a NASCAR spec truck.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he told me he was looking at Radical Cup, and I sent him a couple of emails on that series that, of course, the car is powered by the Hayabusa Suzuki engine, and we'll get into all things Suzuki in just a moment here with Chris Ellis and Nathan Naslund. Stuart, anything else in Nodell's notes tonight?
No, that was it, Pat. Just the sad news about Lloyd Bailey, and then obviously the great news with Jeff Williams. Other than that, you can go ahead with Nathan and Chris.
I'm sure Lloyd packed a lot of living into those 43 years. And my racing announcing colleague, Dave Despain, remember working with Dave, said, because we've all dealt with this over the years, when a fine rider passes away, his words were, "There's a special place in heaven for those who lived life to the fullest," and I'm sure Lloyd certainly did. Just before we wrap up Nodell's notes, of course, earlier this year we lost Art Robbins, and when I arrived home today, there was a package in the mail, and I'll just show it up here to the camera. That is a wood-burned image of Art Robbins, Art the Dart, that Karen Robbins, Art's sister, sent along in the mail. And just thanking everyone here for the tribute we did to Art, remembering him and his racing career earlier this summer. So a big thanks to Karen Robbins and all of Art's family. But I share that little memento here with everyone who was on the call, those people who provided photos and stories when we remembered Art Robbins quite a number of weeks ago now. So let's get on with our two special guests tonight. I've known these two gentlemen for decades. I've spent many Daytona 200 bike weeks with Chris Ellis down in Daytona. Nathan Naslund, many weekends at the racetrack with him. And I see, Nathan, you have vintage Shannonville background there tonight. What year is that from? That paddock is just absolutely jammed.
That's probably from around 2003 in that area. I mean, we've got the Coors Light sponsorship still going at that time by our gray canopy. So it would be in around that area.
Of course, those were one of some 26 years that you had spent with Suzuki Canada, and we'll get into some of the racing and that Suzuki was involved with then. But when I was looking at your path and Chris Ellis's path through motorcycling, as I was saying earlier, that it's very, very similar. You both ran and owned motorcycle dealerships, eventually moving on to major motorcycle manufacturers. And I know you have now moved on to the auto service business since leaving Dealey Harley-Davidson. And Chris Ellis is in temporary retirement, although I think he's looking for his next gig in the motorcycle business. Take us back, and I'll get Chris to comment after, those early years at the motorcycle dealership. What did you learn about the business that really helped you as you moved on to work for one of the motorcycle manufacturers later on? Nathan?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't sure if that was for me or Chris.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things that was one of my earlier employees, and this is going back to my hometown of Camrose, Alberta. And I started there back in the early 70s. They had me working the parts counter. It was a Honda dealership. And eventually got into the back because that's where I wanted to be, was working as a technician. But I remember the owner there because every once in a while I kind of figured I need to make more money. These labor rates, and I'd go in and ask for a raise. And John Hagel, the owner back then, he was a very astute businessman, and he'd show me the books, and he'd bring out this whole big books on how they kept everything, track of this and labor sales and all this. So it really showed me at an early age in the industry, at any business, the importance of your, running a business properly, as opposed to, like there's a saying, there's men in business and there's businessmen. And it showed that you got to be a businessman if you're going to get anywhere in this type of world. And it taught me a lot, and that's going back to the, I actually had my first part-time job there in 1972. And then I worked there for a few years and ended up going in the back as a technician. But yeah, that was, I'll never forget those books that he used to drag out and show me why I didn't deserve a raise.
And Nathan, after that, you then opened up your own dealership, I think Redline Cycle. What was that experience like?
Well, that was a big leap. Actually, it was interesting because it was kind of turnaround. I went from, working in Camrose, and I got scouted by the large Honda dealership in Edmonton, Alberta Cycle at the time. and they had, it was a huge dealership up there, and I worked there as a technician, and that's when I also started my racing activities. But then I was drawn back to Camrose because I had an opportunity to get into business with that same place I used to be at. But looking at how it was all turning out, it just wasn't adding up. So that's when I decided to open up my own shop at Redline Cycle, and took on Suzuki because it was the only brand that wasn't in Camrose at the time. And then we're talking in the late 70s at this time. And it was quite an experience. I mean, it was good. But, for a while there, I opened it up as a one-man show, and then it got going. I had some silent partners in there. But yeah, it was good. But then unfortunately, in that early 80 part, if you recall, Alberta hit a really heavy recession. And that's also when the bank interest rates were in the 20%.
Yep, I remember
People
those.
were walking away from their homes and everything. And my customers basically had all lost their jobs in that too. So, it was just like, what the heck? So I wound down operations, sold off a lot of the stock to one of the shops that was still running in Camrose, and they still are today. And they are the Suzuki dealer as well now and still going. But it was, that was a real tough decision to do, because it had been my lifelong dream to have a bike shop. But, again, knowing that good business sense that I learned from Johnny Hagel way back, it showed me that don't drag yourself down this and lose everything and go bankrupt. And I did it, and I saw lots of other places going bankrupt, losing everything. And I made sure that I got out of there with a clean record, no default or anything. And at the same time, then Suzuki was looking for a service rep in the area, and I got headhunted by them. So the timing just was perfect when I landed at a job at Suzuki Canada.
Okay, we're going to pick up on the Suzuki Canada story, from Suzuki dealer to Suzuki Canada, but I want to go back and revisit sort of that same early journey with Chris Ellis. Chris, what were some of those early experiences working at a motorcycle dealership, then owning Central Ontario Cycle for a number of years?
Well, Pat, it is a very similar story. In the 70s, I was in the car business. I was actually a sales rep for American Motors and Jeep, and was trying to be that big career guy. And I worked part-time at a Suzuki BRP dealer, Honda dealer in Orangeville, which that's how I'd put away my weekends, working for a guy by the name of Jim Daniels. And Orangeville Cycle was pretty interesting. The interesting part was, and what I got to learn from it, was I could work Thursday nights and Saturdays and sell more than the owner could sell through the whole week. So it was a pretty good fit, and led us to the future. Roland McGregor in the fall of 1979 came and poached me from American Motors, offering me a partnership in his store in Kitchener-Waterloo. And you could tell that story for months, but you may know that Roland McGregor was the brother of Tony's mom, so Tony, Todd, and Blair. So I come into the dealership side swirled around by a pretty bunch of road racing orientated people, and the people that, had some pretty good footage in the race business back in the day. And that led to me as a small partner with Roland, and then eventually the ownership of Central Ontario Cycle. We were very lucky, quite successful in the 80s as BMW became a new brand, no longer distributed by a third party. They went OEM original. We were a great Suzuki dealer, as Nathan just said, and then our strength was actually with the Yamaha brand. And then that is what launched the better part of my racing career in the 80s, having so much support, right down to Roland McGregor buying my XR 750 so that I could race with the big boys when I turned expert.
Okay. So both of you, those early years at the dealership, but it's during that time that you really get into racing. Chris, I know you raced flat track and off-road and road racing, but Nathan, you were more of a road racing specialist running at Edmonton International Raceway and Westwood. Both of those tracks, of course, long since closed. What was it like in those early years road racing out west?
It was good. I mean, we had a real strong club in Alberta. Edmonton International Speedway was a fantastic facility, and it had a road racing club there in the late 60s, early 70s, but it's, I guess, had dissolved. But then in 76, you may have know Scotia Fay and Jim Fay. Scotia worked for one of the tire companies. Is that coming to me right off the top? Metzler, maybe? But a bunch of people got together in 76 and started a road racing club again. And I was a bit of a hooligan on the streets and was kind of told to temper it and try this stuff. And so I did. I just joined up. I had my Honda 750. What was funny, I didn't have a truck or anything at the time. And I'd go up to the track with a little sack of tools strapped to the back seat of the bike with my number plates and that, never thinking I'd ever have a crash or anything, and strap that on, say, had a few things safety wired, and go racing and expect to ride home that that afternoon or evening when it was over. Most of the times I did. One time I definitely did it, as we had a big crash at around 105 miles an hour on the straightaway when one of the riders cut in front of me and took out my rear or front wheel. But you know, it was exciting. I mean, Steve Dick was in the club at the time. All of us started at the same time back then. There was some really competitive racers. Warren McKinnon, Bruce Chawanka, Neil Doherty, Joe Risselwis. There was a lot that started up in that club. I mean, when we ran the Nationals the following year in 77, I mean, we were racing with Frank Mrazek and Jim Allen won the expert championship that year in 77 in the Nationals. I came in as the sort of, at that time they called it junior, but it would be equivalent to the amateur superbike now as the national champion for CMA back then. It was competitive, and we'd go out to Westwood. Round 1 in 77 was out there, and that's how I met Frank Mrazek. And if you guys remember Robert Bush, he was driving Frank's van at the time, and that's when I first met Mr. Bush, who long-term friend when I got moved out to Ontario here. But yeah, interesting, the people you meet and still know from back in those early days of racing, and it was some of the best times. And I raced basically until the early 80s when I started with Suzuki Canada. And things had changed a lot with the racing then, because the unlimited class moved out. Like the TZ 750s were popular in the unlimited class. I was racing my Honda that I had punched out to 1,000 cc's and was running Weber carburetors on it and all sorts of crazy stuff. And it would always break things that was the weakest link. That's the one thing you find out about when you do all that kind of stuff. But it was fun. And, I was the mechanic. I was the traveler, drove the stuff, and you just did it. You worked out of the back of a truck and all that. So very different compared to when I got into Suzuki Canada and oversaw stuff like you see in the background there with big budgets like that going on. Tires lasted more than one race back then. You weren't spitting off rubber like crazy now. And that's, such a big expense for the people nowadays compared to back then. But it was exciting, and we all were dealing with the same issues. So it wasn't like someone had a huge advantage.
Well, we're going to come back and talk about Suzuki Canada's involvement through the 80s and 90s with and beyond that with Canadian Superbike racing. But Chris Ellis, let's go back to your early years in racing. Where did you get started, and how did you manage to do all the various kinds of racing, from flat track to off-road, and then eventually to road racing?
Well, it's a funny thing, Pat. Back in the early 70s, I loved motocross, and that's what drove me. I lived in Stratford, Ontario, and I didn't know, I guess, that I had a little bit of speed. And there was a Yamaha dealer in Stratford. We got invited out to a couple of local fun tracks, and I guess I seemed lucky enough to to go fast enough to grab some attention. And the next thing you know, we're at Hully Gully, and we're having fun at motocross. That led me into things like doing cross-country races, and the corduroy was, very passionate at that time. And to my first corduroy, I think it was 77. I won a corduroy log as a junior. It's still a very prestigious thing.
You finished.
And I think, yeah, I finished and actually trophied. And then I think you have to look at, I think I looked at the fact is, I knew I probably couldn't race to be the fastest guy or maybe a champion, although I had some good success in junior and intermediate, won a few Ontario high points and an Ontario championship or a Canadian championship. But the delight that came out of being a retail dealer was my interest in the sport and becoming a sponsor and being part of that group and having guys like Cornwell and Crevier and the dirt track guys, having Todd Sharpless and Bob Sobering. And I could go on an arm's list of people that rode under Central Ontario Cycle. And that drove me to ride all the time. And that's how, if John was riding Daytona, I went and rode around in the pack while he was leading it, especially in 250 and places like that. And that's, I think, what drove me through it. I had very, very much fun in Canada, riding dirt track and creating that atmosphere. I was the rider rep for quite a number of years within the CMA, and even a promoter, put on the New Hamburg Half Mile a couple of times. And we did a really great job. I think when the road racing came in, mostly because Corn Dog was kind of slipping over from dirt to pavement, and my buddy then, Wayne Takeuchi, he was hanging with Corn Dog all the time. And then when I started to road race, he became my mechanic. And we went everywhere, whether it was Daytona or whether it was California, or for me, really lucky with, I love the miles. So doing Syracuse or Indy or Sacramento, any of those races, all I had to do was figure it out a way to be there. That's all that mattered to me, was to make sure that I could get the bikes ready. In my shop, I had Dave Herring that worked for me for years and years, and you may remember him more as a vintage motorcycle mechanic. Very good tech, and through the week he would build my bikes, load them in the truck, so that when we closed the store on Saturday, off I'd be going to Welland or heading to Ohio or wherever the next race was. And I think that's a lifestyle that created my life, is what I can tell you, and took me to the business.
Well, both you and Nathan have spent a lifetime in motorcycling, whether it's at the industry level at a dealership or a manufacturer, or your passion for racing, being involved in that for many, many years. Chris, we want to come back and talk a little bit about your efforts in the international lightweight. I think you ran that once or twice at Daytona. But Nathan, Suzuki Canada was very supportive of the Canadian superbike scene for decades. When I look at the list of riders that they backed over the decades, and I think you were pretty much part of that for its entirety before you left Suzuki Canada to go to Dealey Harley Davidson.
Yeah, actually, when I was looking back over some of this from our call earlier, I found a bulletin dated February 25th, 93, and it was from Doug Stewart, who you may remember.
Yep, remember Doug?
Announcing to the dealer network that I was going to be responsible for all of Suzuki's racing efforts, from road racing, motocross, and enduro, and that all racing activities would fall under my umbrella. And basically it stayed like that until I left Suzuki in 2008. So it was a good long run. It was interesting. I've got the bulletin here. I was just noticing at that time our road racing team was rider was Mario Duhamel.
We've heard of him.
Mike Crompton. For motocross, our rider was Ross Pedersen, and the technician was Mike Haste. And for enduro hare scramblers, our rider was Blair Sharpless, and the technician was also Blair Sharpless.
Yeah, Blair does double duty, but that's quite a lineup of who's who in Canadian racing with all those competitors.
Yeah. Yeah. And then over the years, I mean, the 90s were pretty lean. We didn't run a super bike team back then. I know Kawasaki did. They were very dominant in the 90s with Don Monroe and Michael Taylor and that, but the budgets weren't there. I mean, those were leaner years. The boom of the 80s had trailed off and kind of held into the 90s for a good part of it. But it started to come back as far as motorcycle sales in the late 90s. And that's when things started going and we started getting the bigger teams back and riders started coming up. Steve Crevier came back. And I know it was a sort of interesting time when Steve came back to Canada because I flew out to Vancouver and was talking to him to join our team instead because he had been riding the Yosh bikes down in the States and like the twins and that too. But the Honda dealer was a little sweeter than what I had budget for. We were close, but yeah, it was interesting times. And that's, you know, when you start looking at the road racing, those glory years, which leads to those big tents and the, you know, the semi trailers and all that, that sort of started around that period and ran through a good part of the 80s until the financial crisis hit. And that's when everything just sort of disappeared as far as any money anywhere for road racing or racing almost around the world. You know, riders were having to pay their own way to get us ride in places. The wages that our Canadian riders used to get, I mean, some of them were making pretty good coin. That all evaporated, you know, so it really took a big hit when that recession hit. And we're still struggling to see it come back. It's getting better, definitely, but it's, you know, will we ever see it the way it used to be? I don't know, Pat. I really don't know.
Okay, we want to come back and talk to you a little bit more about those years with Suzuki and then the move to Dealey Harley Davidson, which was a different kind of culture. But Chris, let's resume the story there about your racing, gravitating through off-road motocross, flat track, and then into road racing. I know you had a bunch of different bikes. There was a big single I think you ran. I remember watching you run up through the S's at Westwood, the very last race there. I think it was 89 or 90. Take us through some of those bikes towards the end of your road racing career, and how did some of that machinery come around?
Well, you know, Pat, there's some good stories in there. And the drive for me, last year was my 50th year in a row, most of them with you, to Daytona. A lot of those years were the, you know, short tracks and half miles and AMA points, and something that I wanted. But the key driver was how was I going to get on the speedway at Daytona? And that, I think that's what put me on the pavement in Canada, starting back in the day with the RZ 350, right up through the process of being with the 250 guys, having the Spawn and Rotax, riding with supporting Cornwall, with the two Aprilias, one from you and one for me at that time. And the success I had, the partner that I had in my 250 built that 250 or built a 600 Rotax. It's funny, you get a 600cc 4-stroke single on a 250 2-stroke grid. It doesn't matter if you're in the 4th row, as long as you get a good start, you're going to be in corner 2 first, which is really sometimes not great when you're not the fastest guy, because it gets really crowded at that time. At the same time we were doing that, of course, Tony and Kathleen were riding big bikes, and they were doing Suzuka and doing endurance racing. And we, between Roland McGregor and I, we had supplied many of those bikes. So that opened the door for me to have a 750 Yamaha Superbike. And actually probably my strongest competitive and lap time, especially on the rainy days, which is when I could have the most fun. Had some pretty darn good bikes though. I mean, my 250 Rotax was spectacularly fast. I believe I remember at Daytona, it had a top speed of 161 miles an hour in the trap. And when you think about it, modern 600s today, they're just about to come up into the 180 touch. You could probably tell everybody better than me. But that's kind of the story that led me away from dirt track onto road racing and into some just great times, and some pretty successful results. I mean, you didn't have to talk to me much on the podium, but we sure would interview a lot.
Yeah, top 10 consistently.
Yeah.
Chris, you talked about all those years at Daytona. What was your first year going to Daytona, either to race or just as a fan? Because I know you've got a streak.
I think for 69 for going to Daytona.
Okay.
First Superbike race was 74 to go and watch. Think I saw some really high, first Superbike win, first Freddie Spencer win, many Kenny Roberts wins, things like that. Like, even seeing unusual riders that none of us ever expected to take the checkered flag at Daytona, and with such spirited and fantastic racing, I'm going to say in the late 70s, early 80s. And then the biggest package for me, my good friend Bruce Parker, who is Joe Rocket, and of course he had Nicky Hayden, and then Joe Rocket sponsored a lot of the Miguel, and a lot of the top winners. So it made for very, very fun Daytonas, especially in the pits.
Well, hopefully both you and I can get back there this March. Doesn't look as though the border's going to be open, but may have to just fly down there. I'm going to go back to
airplanes for.
Yeah, Nathan. In addition to taking care of the racing program, what were some of your other duties there at Suzuki Canada, particularly towards the end before you left for Dealey Harley Davidson?
Well, I had quite a great career at Suzuki Canada. At one time, I thought I was going to retire there, but things change, and it didn't happen. But yeah, so I came up on the service side of things as a service rep in Alberta, so looking after Alberta, Saskatchewan, then transferred to Vancouver as a regional manager for service, looking after BC, and then having had some reports. Then in '88, I got transferred opportunity for a national position and got transferred to Ontario. So that's when I moved out east, and I've been here obviously since then. But started out again on the service side, national service manager on the motorcycle side, and then to division manager of all service, automotive, motorcycle, ATV, and marine. Then in '99, the president moved me across and said, "You're going to be the division manager now for recreational products, sales and marketing." So that boom just happened at the beginning of January in '99, and then I stayed on that side. That's when Mark Jeffrey and I hooked up, because he was in the sales side of Suzuki Canada at that time, and stayed in that position until I guess around 2006 or 7. That's when I became the general manager for corporate communications, and that was for the whole company as well, and still looked after all the racing in that as well. And that sort of was my last position there when I resigned in the fall of 2008, just heading into a global recession. Crazy
right, we remember that
position.
So how much was it a transition in terms of culture, going from all those years at Suzuki Canada working for that Japanese company and now moving to Dealey Harley Davidson, and obviously a different kind of culture?
Had I known what I know now, boy, I wish I had started with Dealey's right at the beginning of my career. Working for a Canadian company was such a difference. You know, I work for a Canadian company now, and it makes such a difference compared to working for somebody who's not based in Canada and really do not understand Canada. You know, Dealey's was an amazing place. It really was, and you talk to a lot of people now, even some of the Harley dealers, they miss the Dealey Harley Davidson days. When the motor company came up in 2015 and took over, it changed. And I think you see a lot of the changes out there. There's been a number of smaller locations that have been deemed not necessary, that have been shut down now. I know one of the things at Dealey's we really wanted to make sure was that if you were a Harley Davidson owner, that you had a strong network out there, because I mean, a lot of the bikes we sold are those big heavy touring things, and people don't buy a touring bike to cruise up and down Main Street. They do it to go on long trips, and you want to be able to stop and be able to get an oil change when you need it, or a tire replaced when you need it. And having a good network across Canada is important. Now they're breaking that whole link of dealerships across the country up, and yeah, we have some smaller communities, but they can support it. They did when I was at Dealey's, so I don't see why they wouldn't have kept them. They were good, viable operations, but it's sad. It's really sad to see what's happened. And some of these people that own these dealerships, you know, they put a lot of blood and sweat and tears into building a nice facility and all this, and all of a sudden they get the whole thing pulled away from them. I mean, it's supposed to be a mutual agreement, but I don't think it's as mutual as we'd like to believe, or they want us to think it is. And yeah, so sad to see what's happening. With Harley though, when you look at the motorcycle sales that are happening in Canada, sales are up, but it's primarily the dirt bikes, the off-road, all of that stuff. It's up huge. The actual street bike sales are down. And
Yep.
Harley only sells big, heavy street bikes. They really have none of the smaller ones. Then with the compound that with the fact that the factories were shut down in the spring for the first part of COVID, there's a big, you know, shortage of inventory out there too. So that didn't help matters either. So it's going to be tough. It's interesting. I mean, they've got this new CEO there, Zetz or something like that. He's been on the board of directors. He's been on the board of directors since 2007. So he's not new to the brand, but he doesn't come from a motorcycle background where almost all the other CEOs and that have led the company have. So it'll be interesting to see how this works, but he's got a big job ahead of him, that's for sure. And what's happened in Canada is pretty sad to see.
Okay. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about your days at Dealey Harley Davidson, because during your time there, we had the Harley Davidson XR 1200 series, and you can fill us in a little bit about that. But I want to go back to Chris Ellis. And Chris, following the dealerships and your racing and so forth, 1994, you start with Barrett, who were distributing Triumph, and then later Husaberg and KTM. What was it like back then, and then the change where Triumph decided to open up their own office, if you will, and really start to build a Triumph brand back here in Canada in the late 1990s?
So, you know, you have to look at, Pat, I mean, Barrett's was for me, a transition from rider, racer, retailer to manufacturer. It linked very much back towards my car career, had some decent training and positioning with AMC. So going to Barrett's and being invited to restart the Triumph brand in Canada and bring it back was an unbelievable experience. To turn that into a motorcycle division for a third-party distributor was not easy. You know, you look at small numbers and bringing brands back, but the addition of both Husaberg and KTM in those days added volume and both dollar sales and some bottom line to their business, and gave us, we had a very great broad scope of branding and different branding with different manufacturers. Taking over that and putting people in place to lead each of those brands was fantastic. By 99, when Triumph decided that they wanted to be the distributor, the OEM partner in Canada, they offered me the position at that time, to which was a difficult but successful idea, and of which I took over 25 years ago. In that 25 years, we built a brand. We started literally at zero. I mean, the first year that Triumph was back in Canada, it was 67 sales.
Wow.
You know, it was a slow start, and the brand developed its global footprint very quickly, leading up to 2000, and doing as much as they could for everybody. In Canada, responsibility to build a great dealer network. You know, you look at around from coast to coast and start building the volume. And we had incremental growth year on year, right up until basically when I retired a few months ago. The retirement, somewhat of a COVID push in corporate adjustments, just kind of, you know, I'll lean on kind of that path Nathan was just going, like things were pushed into change in our business. The interesting part on the Euro side, on the good brands, everybody struggled through March and April, but rebounded very quickly in May. The Japanese brands, as Nathan just mentioned, have done extremely well with small displacement bikes and play bikes in the marketplace, and as well as off-road race bikes, largely because a lot of population is at home, they have time, they're not traveling, and people are buying motorcycles. I got to tell you, we're very lucky in our sport and our business. To let a small secret out of the hat, like by the end of October, Triumph's a great example. Even with only big bore displacement bikes over 600 cc's up, they're only down 20 motorcycle sales from the previous year. And even though I don't have my hands on it today, I would tell you they will beat the previous year by December, by the end of this month. It's almost an impossibility not to do it. And that is happening with many brands that they're holding their numbers and getting pulled through. Obviously, not all of them in the bigger displacement street bikes, but there's been some good acceleration for brands like Indian. You know, this situation has helped them in their spot as Harley adjusts itself, both from no longer being a Canadian company with proper penetrated dealer business in the marketplace and trying to have global type marketing. And I think all the companies would like to do something similar based on the costs of doing business in Canada. But the reality, everybody has to remember, all of us as friends in motorcycling and also looking at the dealer networks and the investments they have in their businesses, it's not just the consumer that needs to support those dealers out there. And there's a lot of interaction. When you look at COVID and how it's changed things, when you look at the internet and how e-commerce has changed things, and now you're going to look at how product and product availability. And I can tell you, as a very intensely passionate motorcyclist, and to those people out there who have that same passion, They should buy what they want, because this will be the hardest year. 2021 will be the hardest year to get the bike you wanted because of availability. It'll be interesting because the world is suffering with vendor-related fill.
Yeah, well, we're certainly hearing it from the motorcycle dealers that I talk to. Definitely, inventory is a big problem, certainly in the short term. Nathan, let's go back to your years with Dealey Harley Davidson and the XR 1200 series. You had the likes of Darren James, Steve Crevier, Michael Taylor, and others running that series. Who was the driving force behind launching that series here in Canada? What role did you have in that?
Actually, when I went to Dealey's, I had no involvement with their racing program at all. Darren James kind of had most of that up, and as a racer himself, and it was the marketing department over there and it was quite separate at Dealey's, the marketing and the sales. And Darren worked in there and was pretty much in charge of the road racing that was going on. I mean, it was a great series. I loved it. It was really close action because, it's a spec series. So you always get good racing action in a spec series. But yeah, I would say Darren was the big motivator in bringing all of that into Canada and working behind that because, it gave him a place to race a Harley as opposed to a different brand that he runs at times too back in those days. But it was good. And I mean, the thing, sort of one of the things culture wise from Suzuki to Dealey's, with most of with all of the Japanese companies, they have different presidents come over every 5 years as a rule. And every 5 years, then you get a new president who wants to change the direction of the ship, maybe a little bit. Some want to do a little bit, some want to do a lot. The last one in why I left, he wanted to do a complete 180. You go over to Dealey Harley Davidson, you got Don James, you got Malcolm Hunter, Buzz Green, the same people year after year going in the same direction. So you're not getting this big, all of a sudden, massive change in direction, continuity with the dealers. And it's a huge difference when you have that kind of leadership in a company as opposed to a president who's just a title as a president. They're not, they get that role as a Japanese president, but that's part of the big cultural difference too. That, when you have somebody that's steering the ship the same direction, maybe a little wave here or there just to make improvements, but not a big change.
Nathan, just recently, Harley Davidson Motor Corporation announced the elimination of their factory American flat track team. Of course, in recent years, Indian has really dominated that series. They don't seem to have a motorcycle capable of beating the Indian. Obviously, a cost-cutting measure on one point, but do you think in the long run that will do severe damage to a long and illustrious racing history with Harley Davidson?
Well, it's definitely going to hurt their racing history. How much it's going to hurt? It's sad to see. I mean, the flat track, they also dumped their drag racing as well with Vance and Hines, that partnership.
Yep, I saw that.
Long time as well. I mean, this is probably some of the stuff the new CEO is looking at there because they got bigger, fires to try to put out as far as sales go. And they need to attract younger people to the brand, and it's not happening. And boomers are aging off, and unless they have something to offer, it's going to be tough. The years ahead. And so, as sad as it is to see us losing Harley in those venues, flat track especially. I love flat track. I've been going to flat track since I was a kid. Guys like Rex Turple and that used to race in Alberta, and we'd watch those guys out there on the half miles and that. We had a half mile in my local hometown that we used to, probably what got me hooked on motorcycling back in the early 60s. But anyway, like I say, to see Harley leave flat tracking and expect any sort of dealer supports to even come close to what Indian is putting out there, it's going to be tough. But remember, Indian isn't just Indian. Indian is Polaris, and Polaris is big. a lot, they've got all this other stuff behind them. They're selling ATVs and side-by-sides through the roof. You can't, we think motorcycle sales are doing well. Well, the ATV and side-by-sides are just going crazy as far as sales too because of COVID. So, they got a lot of extra funds coming in a giant company like Polaris where they can support a lot more of this, where really Harley doesn't have that kind of feed of extra income coming in. Harley is Harley. There's nothing else.
Okay, looks like we've got Chris Ellis back. Before we go to Chris, Nathan, Harley's come out with their live wire, their electric bike. It is a marketing challenge trying to find the next generation of Harley Davidson buyers. Where do you think the company is going to go? Because obviously to this point, the millennials, that next generation of Harley buyers, just aren't buying their current offerings that they have.
Yeah, well, they won't be buying the live wire either, not at the price tag that's coming in at. You're looking at, I think, $38,000 or something like that by the time taxes and that are all added onto it in Canada. I mean, it's great that they were the leader in it, but they've got to come out with something more reasonably priced to get any millennials and that looking at it. It's it's great to see somebody come out with it, but the thing is too, it's still got the range issue and all that. You're not going to go far. I mean, like you can hop on for a whole Sunday ride on your Harley or your Triumph or whatever, your old Honda that I've got, on any of those, and go, and you stop for gas and you can take off again instead of having to worry about recharging and that. So even some of the little day runs I do, I couldn't do it on a live wire. I'd be stranded. It just can't have that distance.
Well, that technology, I think, definitely has to improve. Chris Ellis, good to have you back on board. We were talking about Daytona a little bit earlier. 2014, 47 years after Gary Nixon won the 67 Daytona 200, Danny Eslick wins on a Triumph Daytona 675 triple. I had the good fortune of being invited to the victory party that night at a restaurant just across the street from the Speedway, and you could really sense the tremendous pride and sense of accomplishment that after 47 years, there was the Triumph brand back in victory lane at Daytona. Is that one of the high points of all your years of going down there to be part of that?
Absolutely. Felt like I won it myself. It was that good. That many people to be in winner's circle at the end with the Triumph logo on top of the stage, on top of the podium, was just unbelievable. There was a good build up to that, Pat. We had changed, shifted gears at Triumph. Management in North America was very much looking at racing as part of Triumph's heritage. We'd had some very great riders up in Canada. You have to look at, with Reedman bringing us 2 600cc Canadian championships. Unfortunately, the year before that, we lost JR, but, he brought us a lot of front and brought a lot of really great coverage for Blackfoot and the McRae family. Triumph there was a lot of linked, passionate relationship. And then to get to Daytona with a team of 3 factory riders and then plus the other team and winning the event, I don't know that it could be any better. I mean, you were there, you celebrated with us, you saw the elation in the group and the people that were involved and responsible for it.
Where does Triumph go from here? I know their involvement with Moto2. Where do you see the Triumph racing program going in the years to come? Is there a Triumph Superbike that we may see in World Superbike or maybe even MotoGP? What's on the drawing board without giving away anything that you've been sworn to secrecy on?
Yeah, so I think what you have to look at is both John and Nick Bloor, being in the UK and looking at the value of the brand and of course the budgets that are related to it. And as Nathan mentioned earlier, it's always hard to have the right budget at the right time to win a championship. So for 3 years, we built up the Moto2 situation as Honda backed away, and we became the engine supplier. And it was with a very great schedule of introduction. The factory was very involved and very positive. Prior to that, though, we had a lot of involvement with British Supersport and with other related racings, and there was some good, especially in the UK, a good undertow of some great riders. I went to the Isle of Man about 4 years ago, and we actually finally persuaded the factory to get involved with the Isle of Man again, because while I was there, lucky enough to see us win, it just couldn't have been, as a privateer winning, it just couldn't have been much better. So spin forward to today, just getting ready to start the second year of Moto2. To be a little bit cliche, when you watch Moto2, a Triumph wins every race, which is kind of fun. The net reality, if you noticed, it was just announced 2 weeks ago that Triumph will be back involved with British Supersport in the UK Superbike series. I believe that will bring a lot of color to the brand, especially at home and likely around the world. In Europe. I think the hardest part about that will be seeing the company get involved in racing in North America. And, I like to think of myself as a very wide scope motorcycle brand guy that was captured by Triumph with a job to do and huge passion. That motorcycle you see behind me, that Scrambler 1200, is my 25-year Rolex watch, which was a gift from the Bloor family. I could never thank anybody enough for that.
That's awesome. I'd take the bike over the watch anytime.
Any day, right? So when you look at that and what's going to go on here, I think you'll see some different paths. We got a good guy running North America, Rod Lepuznak. He comes from a strong background. He had over 20 years at Suzuki. He hired people like Ricky Carmichael. He just knows how to move things in the right direction. So it'll be interesting to see what the future holds. To jump on Nathan's bandwagon here, I am an XR750 owner. I raced XR750s. I lived the Harley brand. I loved it. And they're walking away from their core customers, and they're walking away from real flat track racing because they're embarrassed that Indian built the FTR and kicked their ass. And that's too bad, because nothing would be more vibrant than to see them do the exact opposite, develop a bike and come back and take that number one plate back.
Yeah, particularly if that racing bike can also be turned into a street motorcycle, as Indian has done with the FTR street version. Nathan, we're going to give you the last word here. Your final thoughts, if you can look into your crystal ball. Where's Harley Davidson going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Boy, unless they come out with some big changes on how they market to younger people, it's going to be a tough road to hoe. When you look at some of these, like Bloomberg and some of these different magazines and economic journalists down in the States, they could, they're talking that, it might be that some bigger company takes over Harley Davidson. I mean, you see with so many brands already, they're run by other companies. Like when you look at some of the European brands, there's a lot of them that are taken over by a larger parent organization. And so they might end up doing something like that down the road. It's not like they haven't been there before. I mean, they had that back in the late 60s when they were taken over and ran by in those days of, what was it? Not Brunswick, but the parent company of Brunswick there, the
AMF.
AMF,
years.
right.
I mean, that was
Yeah.
scary. And so hopefully if something like that happens, and there's sort of, when I was reading some of those articles, there's rumors of Ford, there's rumors of John Deere, there's all sorts of big companies that could easily take it over if something was to happen down the road. But they got to really change. It's going to be interesting to see where they are down the road. But what is encouraging is to see so many dirt bikes being sold, because that's how so many young people started into motorcycling is with dirt bikes, and we got that going. So, I mean, hopefully the bug will stick with them like it did with me, like it did with Chris, and so many of us as a young age, it becomes a life. And I just was a motorcyclist and was lucky to work in the motorcycle industry for most of my career.
Yeah, well, as I've
point too, brand wise, I can ride my Honda, I can ride my Suzuki's, I can ride my Harley. It doesn't matter, and I've got them all in my garage. And I'm getting my Bandit ready for more track days up at Mossport, and it's just fun.
Awesome. Well, as I've said to a few people, there's no better way to social distance than with your helmet on and riding on a motorcycle. So I think if there's any silver lining from us having to deal with COVID-19 and the tragedy we've seen around the world is that, yeah, motorcycle sales are up. And I'm sure when the sales figures for November and December come out, those numbers are going to be up pretty much right across the board. Nathan and Chris, we want to thank you for coming on board tonight. Before you go, I'm going to go to Stuart and Odell. I think we may have a couple of last questions as we go over time here on Track Announcer's Notebook. Stuart?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. We just got a quick question for Chris, and the question is, there's a rumor that his band is back in rehearsal. Will there be a tour in the future?
Absolutely, for sure. Not much different than racing motorcycles. The best thing about Blown Cover is most of our work is done as a charity. I mean, we like to go to a bar and rock, but we've done Special Olympics and we've done a lot of charity organizations. And the one thing we love, and most of the all of the members of the band, they like to rock and roll, but it sure is great just to be back and see everybody rocking and riding.
Well, I've seen that band at some of the Barnapalooza events, and they know how to rock the house. Anything else, Stuart?
Yeah, just I guess for each of the guys is what their thoughts are on the lightweight class, and do they see future road racing stars coming through those ranks?
I'd say absolutely. I mean, that lightweight class is some of the most exciting racing to watch. It reminds me of like Moto 3, whether you watch it, both the last couple of years at Mossport, watching them come off the top of the back straight. We were parked up on the top there, Catherine and I. It was just like, whoa, how close can these guys get? Very exciting stuff. And I think what Tony is doing too now with her school, that there's an opportunity to get a lot more people racing. I guess part of the big thing is controlling expenses, and as I mentioned, tires being such a big part of that, and that's something that's going to have to be figured out. But there's definitely a good group of talented young riders coming up through that series.
Chris, your thoughts on lightweight?
Yeah, I'm with Nathan all the way. I mean, no different than this fabulous increase of retail during COVID and putting thousands upon thousands of small displacement dirt bikes out there. That's going to create the next wave of motorcycling. And it's all of our responsibility to culture that and bring it to that next wave. It's so important. Get the kids riding.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up tonight's edition of Track Announcer's Notebook. Our thanks to Nathan Naslin and Chris Ellis for being our guests tonight. And let's go to Stuart Nodell for final thoughts, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to thank both Chris and Nathan for joining us. It was great to listen to both their histories in the sport. And I think what they said is true. We need more motorcycle people in the motorcycle industry. And yeah, definitely cultivating the talent that's coming out there with the smaller displacement bikes in terms of racing. There's lots of talent, just we need accessibility, and we got to make it affordable so families can get their kids involved in this great sport. So again, just thank the guys for joining us tonight.
Okay, be well, Chris and Nathan, and thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight for Track Announcer's Notebook. Have a great week. We'll see you back here next Monday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Have a great week. Good evening.